Hello, greetings to you wherever and whenever you might be watching this. My name is Aidan Flax Clark, and I work at the New York Public Library. I'm here to welcome you into tonight's conversation, so thank you for being here. The title, of course, is Birds of New York, and we are very lucky to have as a partner on it NYC Audubon. NYC Audubon is a grassroots community that works for the protection of wild birds and habitat in the 5 boroughs, improving the quality of life for all New Yorkers. And joining us tonight is a really fantastic group of speakers that we're so happy to have with us. We have Akilah Lewis, Secretary of the Feminist Bird Club and a co-organizer for 2021's Black Birders Week, Dr. Kevin Bergio, Director of Conservation Science at NYC Audubon, and Jordan Rudder, co-founder of Bird Names for Birds. Moderating the conversation is Christian Cooper, who's a writer, an editor, and a board member at NYC Audubon. Tonight's event is inspired by our new exhibit, Treasures. The Polonsky exhibition of the New York Public Library's Treasures, which is at the Schwarzman Building in Midtown, showcases some of the most extraordinary items from the 56 million in our collections. They tell the story of people, places, and moments spanning 4,000 years. I'm sitting in front of a few of them right now. I think the Declaration is here. Sorry, I can't see. This is the Declaration of Independence in Thomas Jefferson's handwriting. This is a manuscript page in James Baldwin's handwriting. Up here is art by Norman Lewis. Behind me is art by Anna Atkins. And of course, I think up here is John James Audubon, because we had to have him tonight. You will get a chance to learn a little bit more about him and his work, and the item that's in Treasures, our giant copy of Birds of America, in just a minute, because we also have with us tonight Meredith Mann, who is a librarian in our Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books division, and also I think a pretty serious bird nerd. So she's going to tell you a little bit about John James Audubon and our copy of his book. Meanwhile, you can go to nypl.org/treasures to register for your free time ticket to go check out the exhibition yourself. And if you can't make it, explore that page, because there's a digital version of all the items in the exhibition, a really fantastic audio guide, and a whole lot more. It's nypl.org/treasures, and I believe we'll put the link in the chat for you as well. One of the reasons that we really love doing programs around treasures is that the legacies of a lot of these really important historical items are extremely complicated. I mean, take the Declaration of Independence, right? It's a cornerstone of American democracy, written by a man who owned slaves. And the copy that we have in his handwriting has the paragraph in which he denounces slavery that he later deleted. Audubon and his work are similarly complicated. He was a legendary painter. His name is a byword for birding, conservation, environmentalism, but he was also a slaveholder and quite anti-abolitionist. So you have to ask, how do we celebrate Birds of America? Do we celebrate Birds of America? I know Audubon societies have contended with this question, how they do the crucial work that they do, which benefits all of us, and do it in the name of such a man. Those complicated legacies, like I said, they're a huge part of the Treasures exhibition, and we're really grateful for opportunities like these to acknowledge and hopefully explore them. The next program in our Treasures series will be on November 16th. It's with Merve Emre and the New Yorker's James Woods. They'll be talking about Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway, which Merve just published an annotated new edition of. And there are many more live from NYPL events past that. Tomorrow night, we have philosopher Barrett Holmes Pittner discussing racism, cultural erasure, and ethnocide with Lewis Gordon. To see that event and the others, go to nypl.org/live. And of course, please register and come see us again. I'm going to hand the reins over to Meredith in just a minute. Just a couple quick things. All of tonight's panelists would love to take some of your questions, and you can send them at any time starting now. You can use the chat, the Google form, or you can email publicprograms@nypl.org. We'll make sure that they see them, and they'll get to as many as they can at the end. Also, real-time captions are available for tonight's program. You can click on the closed caption button or use the stream text link shared in the reminder email and the chat for a live transcript. Okay, so that's it. Again, thank you so much for being here, and let's get to it. Let's turn things over to Meredith Mann.
Thanks so much, Aidan, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm here to talk about this image, among others. This is a shot from Audubon's The Birds of America, what we call the double elephant folio edition, for reasons that will become clear shortly. And this is on permanent display in the New York Public Library's Treasures exhibition. So I thought that what I could talk about today is how this work was created, and for birding enthusiasts out there, some interesting things about these plates from the perspective of a birder. So I thought I'd start with this image of the Carolina Parrot, or as we know it, of the Carolina Parakeet, because it really showcases the beauty of the illustrations and their intricate detail and the liveliness of the birds that are depicted on these plates. And all of these plates began as watercolor sketches made by John James Audubon, who grew up observing birds. But what people might not realize is that he did shoot and kill the birds that he depicted in the Birds of America. He would, after collecting the specimens, he wired them into poses that imitated how he saw them in nature, and then drew them within days or hours, basically as quickly as he could after obtaining these specimens. So he describes that as drawing from nature, but that is a little different than what we might think of as drawing from nature. It wasn't strictly observation. So once he had the watercolors, he then needed someone to reproduce them. So he eventually ended up working with Robert Havell Jr. of London for the most part, who converted these watercolors onto etchings on copper plates so that they could be printed, in the copy after copy. And a team of colorists then went through and hand colored each of these plates. And there are 435 plates in total in Birds of America. So this was a monumental undertaking. And speaking of monumental, if we can go to the next slide, the other thing that's extremely notable about Birds of America is its size. It is 40, each sheet of paper is 40 inches tall by 27 inches wide. But I don't think that you really get an idea with numbers. So my colleague Tal Naden is standing here next to the Great Horned Owl so that you can get a feel for the size of this tome. It takes two people to turn the page. It takes two people to lift the volume. As I mentioned, there were 435 plates in total, and they were sent out in batches to subscribers so that Audubon could be getting money during the printing to finance the rest of the plates. And then at the end of the day, once you had all of your plates, the idea was that you would bind them into 4 separate volumes. And if we can go to the next slide, the reason why he wanted to have the book be so big was, I think, first to be splashy, but also he wanted to depict birds in their actual size. So for some, even 40 by 27 was difficult. So that's where we see plates like the American flamingo, where he's kind of contorted the bird in order to fit the dimensions of the page. So Havell and Audubon printed about 200 or so complete sets. About 120 survive in their original format. One that sort of survives, but definitely not in its original format, we can see here on the next slide. Audubon marketed his book to mainly wealthy subscribers because they were the ones who would be able to afford the $1,000 price tag. And that's $1,000 in 1840s money for these plates. And one such buyer, Lady Hertford, you can see her sitting room at the Temple Newsome Estate in England here. And what looks like ornate decor in their room. If you look a little closer, you can see the image on the right. The wallpaper is painted with the backgrounds, but then they have cut out and pasted on the birds from the double elephant folio of Audubon to decorate the wallpaper. So we have 120, maybe more in private hands. Including our set at the New York Public Library. And if we move on to the next slide, so that's sort of from an artistic perspective, but from a scientific perspective, Audubon's work is important because he documents birds like the Carolina parakeet that are no longer extant today. So here we have on the left, his drawing of the ivory-billed woodpecker, and on the right, Bachman's warbler, which I'm sure a lot of us saw in the news that these two species, while presumed extinct for a long time, were recently declared extinct. So these are birds that we are potentially only able to see through works like Audubon's, because they no longer exist in the real world. Others include the passenger pigeon, the Labrador duck, the great auk, the Eskimo curlew. But in addition to birds that Audubon caught that we can't see, if we go to the next slide, we'll see there are also birds that Audubon didn't include. Audubon himself traveled as far west as the Badlands. He relied on others to send him specimens from the West Coast. So he missed a fair number of Western birds. In terms of East Coast birds, on the left here, one that he didn't include was the mourning warbler, seen here at its recent residency near the World Trade Center Memorial. And on the right, another bird that is not included is the European starling. Audubon had a very good excuse in that the European starling didn't exist in America yet, because it was introduced in 1890 when one man with a dream, Eugene Schieffelin, thought that all the birds mentioned in Shakespeare should be resident in America. So he released 60 starlings right here in Central Park in New York City. And now we have about 150 million of them. So now they are very much the birds of America. And then if we go to the next slide, Audubon has also left us with a few, they call them birds of mystery. So birds that he identifies in Birds of America, but that we don't quite know, is this a bird that has since gone extinct? Or is he looking at a morph or a juvenile or some alternate plumage that might connect with a bird that we're familiar with. So this is a bird, the bird that you see here is what Audubon called a carbonated warbler. And below it, you'll see an immature Cape May warbler, which is kind of our best guess as to the bird that Audubon might have been trying to depict. And you can see the darker cap, the eye line, the speckling on its breast. So our best guess is that might be the bird that he was talking about. But it's still not a certain thing. So if we go to the last slide, the image that I thought I'd leave us with is one of my favorites from Birds of America. And it's the mockingbird, or what we will call the Northern Mockingbird. And it's this dynamic image of a rattlesnake, perhaps not scientifically accurate, but a rattlesnake that is curled up around the mockingbird nest and is attacking one while the others are rushing in to defend the group. And it's one of my favorites. And I wanted to end on it because, Northern mockingbirds are incredibly common here in New York. And at times maybe we take them for granted because we see them everywhere because they're loud. But if we take the time to notice them and observe them, we see, they have striking, beautiful plumage. They're mimics, so they have these complex, interesting calls. They're full of attitude. I think they're very jaunty. So, they're loud, they're proud, and they take up space. And so in that way, I think that they're a quintessential bird of New York. And so that's the image that I wanted to leave you with as we begin our excellent conversation tonight. So thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christian Cooper. I'm a board member of New York City Audubon, and I'll be the moderator tonight for our discussion. And I was trying to think about, okay, what words of wisdom can I impart at the beginning of our discussion? So I went out to Tompkins Square Park in the East Village with my laptop to sit there and sort of draft some comments, having no idea what I was going to say. And I noticed a little tiny bird moving around in the shrubbery. And I was wearing these glasses, which are the wrong glasses because these are my reading glasses. So all I could see was this little blur. But I could pretty much guess by the size and the way it was behaving that it was a ruby-crowned kinglet. But in addition to that little bird, there was a birder standing there, a woman with binoculars who was observing it. And we ended up striking up a conversation. And it turns out that she's a new birder. She's only been birding for the last year and a half. She started birding during the coronavirus epidemic. And that is a story I have heard over and over and over again. The number of birders now has swelled here in New York and elsewhere to huge numbers. This is birding's moment. And so there's no better place to bird than in New York, and we're going to talk about that. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, something called the New York State Birding Trail was launched by the State Department of Environmental Conservation. And it's not really a trail that you walk from place to place through the whole state, but it's a catalog, basically, a listing of all the birding hotspots, eventually in every region of the state by 2022 that you can go and visit. So birding has really become a thing, but there are challenges. There are challenges for the birds. There are challenges for the birders of all stripes. And there are challenges in ethics, as was discussed earlier, that because our consciousness as a society is expanding about past injustices, and birding as part of our society is enmeshed in some of those ethical issues, just like everything else. And just yesterday, the Public Design Commission voted to remove a statue of Thomas Jefferson from the city council chamber because he'd been a slave owner. Well, that spills into birding too. As was mentioned, John James Audubon was a slave owner. So what do you do about that? You know, we're not going to debate the merits of Thomas Jefferson's statue in the council chamber, but we'll definitely talk about John James Audubon and the similar issues that run through birding. So to help me do that, we have Dr. Kevin Bergio, who works for New York City Audubon. Yay! We have Akilah Lewis, who I've worked with for Black Birders Week and who is with the secretary, if I'm not mistaken, of the Feminist Bird Club. And we have Jordan Rudder, who has established Bird Names for Birds, one of the founders, which will get us into that whole naming conversation. But I think my first question, and we're gonna have a very informal conversation here and bounce things back and forth, but I want to lob the first question to start off with to you, Akilah, and that is, you know, since birding is booming and since New York is one of the best places to bird in the country, what do you find makes birding in New York City unique?
Yeah, first, I love birding in New York City. I mainly bird in Queens. I love birding in Queens, but I think something that makes birding in New York City in particular very unique is how the birds are concentrated in a lot of the green spaces throughout the city. I find that if I try birding upstate or on Long Island, the birds are really spread out and it kind of feels a little more difficult to look for the birds. I feel like the city kind of spoiled me because I can be in Bryant Park enjoying lunch with a friend and there's a common yellowthroat bouncing around by my feet. They're very familiar with people. They become accustomed to it throughout their migration or even as they're breeding. So I feel like that's one thing that really makes New York City unique for birding.
And Kevin, does that match with your experience? And what is the source of some of that density that we find here?
Well, my experience in New York City is rather limited since I just started working here in March. But I am constantly surprised by how many species you could put into a small park. Because I learned how to bird up in Connecticut, which is very wooded. And as Akilah said, you really have to pound the ground to get a lot of species there, except in a few areas. But in New York City, just going to Bryant Park or going to Central Park, you see a ton of species in a very small area, which, makes things a lot easier. Absolutely. And we're in the middle, we're kind of part of a big migratory kind of corridor here. And so especially during migration, it kind of like concentrates the birds here in New York City. So it's quite phenomenal for me to see.
I think the idea of a migrant trap, that the birds who migrate at night are pulled in by the lights of the city, and then they
Right.
kind of all focus into these green patches where they can actually find food and refuel. Well, so let me ask you this then, Kevin. We live in a city, we're talking about that density. Besides the density, there's also tremendous diversity, both in terms of people and in terms of bird species. Are there any insights, parallels, connections that you would draw between those two?
Yeah, in thinking about New York City and the bird life here and the people that live here, we have, our residents that live here year round, our breeding birds, and they're did not evolve to live in a city. They evolved to live in natural areas, and they've adapted and prosper and here in the city, much like our native New Yorkers, right? They're very resilient and adaptable. And then you have our migrant birds that kind of come through like tourists a couple times a year. They clearly don't know where they're going. They're kind of confused. And then you have all the birds that have come here, from other places, like the European starling, which was mentioned before, and have made this place their home as well. So there is a lot of kind of parallels between the people that live here and the birds that we find throughout the year.
Jordan, do you find anything similar? I know you're based in DC, but do you find anything similar in DC?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of build off of the great points Kevin made. So from a scientific biological standpoint, a healthy ecosystem is really made up of diversity, right? A healthy bird habitat, in a scientific standpoint, you get extra points, so to speak, with the more biodiversity that you have, the more bird species you have, the more plant species and everything. And I think that's a parallel and lesson that we can learn for people, because, having different perspectives, having different backgrounds, having different people of all walks of life together as a community makes you stronger. It makes us better. And so, you hear more so in agriculture, monoculture is not sustainable. It's not good long-term. And I think that's something too, just reinforcing how having that kind of collection of incredible diversity is really good. And the birds have it, so we can have it too.
So resilience on both scores.
Exactly.
All right, well, let me lob the next question in your general direction then, because it's a names question. So regarding Audubon and birds, why should we care? And how do you feel about the various names of persons that are scattered throughout the bird world? And this is sort of right up your alley.
Yeah, so this is definitely a big question. So tell me to stop talking or if anything, if I need to. But let me pose this to our audience, especially if they're newer birders or not bird people at all. Audubon shearwater, Clark's nutcracker. What do those two things mean to you? What do you envision? Can you even know what we're talking about? You probably have an idea that we're talking about birds, but those are not descriptive names. Those are examples of eponymous names, which means that a human name has been put onto a non-human thing, in this case, a bird. And so are we really having good communication? That's something for us to consider. Are we really honoring birds and putting their intrinsic value first? That's questionable, because we're putting that possessive human aspect on it. And then third, what do we know about these people? Do we all know that Clark of Clark's Nutcracker is Clark of Lewis and Clark? Maybe. But then you dive into these questions about who are these people? And Audubon was really well known. However, we haven't really acknowledged his past as a slave owner until more recently. And so rectifying the contributions the artwork, the conservation impacts of Audubon is something that we need to deal with when we're talking about social justice issues, because these bird names, these eponymous names, are effectively verbal statues. They're putting our values, they're putting the fact that colonialism and racism are built into our structure of society right at the forefront. And I think we really have this opportunity to talk about bird names as the tip of the iceberg, a conversation starter that will allow us to hopefully make one step forward, take action today on something that we can do as we start talking about these bigger, more important, longer term issues that we really need to deal with.
So for you, it doesn't end with just changing the name of the bird, or does it?
No. So very briefly, and I encourage everyone to definitely learn more, and there's lots of information on the Bird Names website, but the process of how these names came to be is a huge aspect of this initiative and of the conversation, because all of these names are a concrete group. They all have a similar structure and came to be. So basically, typically white men like Audubon discovered birds for the first time, which we know is not true, because that's ignoring all of the important indigenous people that celebrated and knew these birds first. And Audubon then named these birds, and other men too, after other men that typically were white. And now they're overseen by a committee that is predominantly white. Where is the incredible diversity and different perspectives and representation across the bird community, birding and ornithology, in that process? To change the names would be important, but to really change the process and include more voices in what those names should be and how we celebrate these birds is really what it's about. It's about the community coming together truly and deciding how we move forward and how much better we can be.
So what would you change the name to?
That's for the community to decide. I have my own personal opinions, but I think that ultimately, maybe not popular vote, so we don't get names like Bodie McBoatface for birds, but having really good descriptive names. Another example of a eponymous bird name is Wilson's Warbler. And some folks, especially on social media, have thrown out some really creative names, everything from toupee warbler to black-capped yellow warbler. I think this is where we can really highlight, and especially given this is a library event, let's pull in people that have this literary experience, that know really beautiful creative words that I don't. I'm a total bird person. But having those different perspectives and different voices could lead to something even more wonderful. So, yeah.
Akil, I'm going to throw it over to you. You're a longtime birder. You're a black birder. What's your take on this whole discussion?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Jordan said. And as the secretary of the Feminist Bird Club, we want to continue the conversation of having people who have their passion for social justice and combining that with their passion for birds. And I think understanding the history behind the birds and why these names can leave people out of the conversation and also exclude them from wanting to join the conversation. Someone who is familiar with the past of Audubon or these other people, they'll say, well, if someone is comfortable having that name as a bird name or as a name of something else, maybe I'm not comfortable around those people. So we want to make sure that these spaces are inclusive for everyone.
All right, so let me play devil's advocate for a second, because most people hear Audubon and they don't think slave owner. Most of them probably don't even know that he was a slave owner. They just think birds. If they think that, either they think either birds or they think German superhighway, one of the two. But Audubon is so much a part of New York, and I think that's something we haven't discussed. The exhibit at the library has one of the few giant elephant folios with the reproductions, the prints. 433, I think, of those original watercolors of the 436. You just go a little further uptown and they're housed at the New York Historical Society. They've got all those original Audubon prints. You go up to Audubon Terrace, a neighborhood on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and that's where Audubon is buried. You walk around there, and there are beautiful murals of birds on all these different shutters and walls and things. So Audubon really has a long, deep history in New York. And are you saying we should chuck that?
I think that's a conversation for us to definitely have. Like, is that something we want to represent ourselves going forward?
I'll also ask the question of, why does he need birds then? Aren't there other ways that we can celebrate his contributions without actually having that possessive nature of a bird name? I'd also say that this is why we need a community conversation. Again, birding as a hobby, ornithology as a science. We need everyone that says these names every day to be part of this conversation. Because how do you rectify this incredible work of art with the fact that we all now, well, at least the four of us and maybe the audience, know that he owned slaves? How do we deal with the fact that these words to some people, I'll go back to Clark's Nutcracker, Wilson's Warbler, the perception and understanding of those names has changed, right? For many birders, I think Cooper's hawk, I'm just going to keep giving examples because there's 150.
No, we're not changing that one. No.
But these bird names, I think we took them for granted, and the history was over an oversight on our part. But all of a sudden, Bird Names for Birds is not about cancel culture. If anything, we're about educating our history and making sure that it's known and we acknowledge it and are conscientious about the steps forward. You can read biographies of these individuals on our website, and I think all of a sudden it's really hard for me to say these names. It's really hard for me in my daily life to talk about some of these eponymous bird names, because we're talking about individuals, not to be a broken record, but Audubon owned slaves. Townsend of Townsend's Warbler was a grave robber of indigenous graves. How do we deal with that? Is that something that we want to put at the forefront of our values? I personally don't. I think that we can at least remember them in other ways than the birds that bring so many of us joy.
All right, so repeatedly in that discussion of names has come up the idea of inclusion, inclusiveness, people feeling comfortable in a birding environment. So can you guys tell me, and I'll throw this open to all of you, but maybe we'll start with you, Akila, since you're to my right on my screen. What barriers, what challenges, what situations have you encountered when you've tried to bird in New York City?
Yeah, so I think some of the, more obvious barriers are just that I don't have a car. It is kind of difficult for me to go birding outside of New York City, so I tend to bird along subway routes or bus routes because I just know it's easier for me to physically get there. Some other barriers that are not so obvious, for example, might be gatekeeping or I think the way that some birders might not necessarily share information or include other people in their events. I remember, for example, I was interested in participating in a bird event and I was told it was full. And then later on, I found out I was able to join and it wasn't full at all. And they actually were welcoming of more people, but for whatever reason, I wasn't able to join at first, maybe because I was considered a novice birder. So I think accepting all types of birders from every walk, no matter if they just started yesterday or they've been birding for 40 years, I think including birders from no matter their background, their religion, their creed, I think everyone should be included in birding in as many ways as possible.
And I'll just interject regarding your birding by subway that New York City Audubon does offer a birding by subway map. So, and it's free. So I just had to sandwich that in as a board member of New York City Audubon.
Yes,
Jordan,
I looked at that map.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's really wonderful. But I'm biased. Jordan, you do not bird New York City, but you bird in DC, which may have similar issues. What have you run into as challenges to birding effectively?
Well, I definitely have experience personally and can echo Akila's sentiment about gatekeeping. I think that there's definitely a lot of unofficial, maybe unspoken judgment, as well as competition almost, especially when you want to compare your life list number. I personally stopped counting my life list because I didn't like that. I thought it was easier to not know my number when people asked. Also, I personally just am about the birds instead of my list.
Just to interrupt, amplify for 1 second, life list for those who don't know, maybe don't know what that is.
Yes, thank you. Yes, a life list is the number of bird species that you have seen in your life. So it's basically just that collated number of how many species you've seen. And usually the more birds that you've seen is this badge of honor, this status symbol almost, because obviously, if you have the privilege to travel a lot or go to a lot of places, your list might be larger just because there are birds all over the world. I'll also add that I just this year have experienced numerous times where I'm out birding with my partner and bird name co-founder Gabriel Foley, who is a cis male. He is a very obvious white man, and folks in the field will go up to him and ask what birds have we seen, or questions about what's going on, and I'm usually ignored. Now I'm a cis woman, which has a lot of privilege, especially being white, but that difference is still very obvious. And I just want to acknowledge that, because access issues, whether it's to green spaces, or huge shout out to Birdability Week happening right now, to folks that have other, either disabilities or different body abilities. There's lots of different aspects that go into birding, and barriers are very complicated. And I think, just coming back to bird names, words matter, and words can be a barrier as well. After the birds themselves, bird names are really what we talk about the most. They're probably the second most common thing for birding, just because that's how we communicate. And so having really clear, good communicative names could go a long way.
You touched on Birdability Week, Jordan, so I want to swing that over to Kevin. As a person with a disability, have you run into any issues that you want to share?
Sure. I mean, my disabilities are invisible, right? So, I don't present. I mean, I'm a cis white male, so I don't present. It's not apparently obvious that I have some sort of disability. But to go back a little bit to what people were saying about gatekeeping and kind of this feeling like there's this elitism or whatever in birding. I wrote a tweet a while ago that seemed to resonate with a lot of birders when I was starting out. And even to this day, I don't have the best set of binoculars you can buy. And my tweet was, I went up to somebody and asked them if they saw anything good. And automatically their eyes go down to your binoculars. And I said, hey, man, my eyes are up here. It's the first thing you see when people, they look at your binoculars. And if you don't have Swarovskis or you don't have Zeiss or whatever, they're like, So, but anyway, to get back to birdability, I am a disabled veteran. I severely injured my back and hip while I was in the service. And it's often hard for me to bird, especially if there's a lot of hills and everything. And often when I'm out with my daughter birding, so I'm trying to teach her how to bird, and we have to leave because I'm just in so much pain. And the pain is, it's hard to focus on what you're looking at when you're in chronic pain. And so like, I mean, as a cis white male, I don't have the same kind of overt kind of gatekeeping or whatever, but all of mine is internal. And it certainly makes things a lot more difficult for me to go out birding and with me and my daughter or whoever I'm with. And we often, I just say, I can't, like Chris, that feminist bird club, queer birders walk that we led, I had to leave early because I was just in so much pain. I couldn't focus on what was going on. So that's kind of, it's not in the way that the others were talking about kind of barriers, but it's just a barrier of just the amount of time I can spend doing it.
And I want to pick up on what you said about binoculars, because that's a barrier to entry. I think that's the biggest barrier to entry to birding, and is the price of binoculars. They are a pricey piece of equipment, and they're out of a lot of people's reach. Even, a relatively inexpensive pair is still going to be like $200, and that's a significant outlay. So I'm always very conscious that, and I had the same experience as you had. I'd been birding the park for a while, so people knew I was a halfway decent birder, but then they would look at my binoculars and they would look at me and they'd say, how can you see anything through those? Because, they all had Swarovskis hanging around their neck. And I'm like, I see more birds than you do, so I don't want to hear it. But Akila, I want to bounce this back over to you, because even as I say, binoculars are a barrier to entry. Are they really? Do they have to be? And I know you had some thoughts on that, on how one can bird in various ways.
Yeah, so I think, there's this typical image of birding where someone's going out, they're venturing to a space, maybe with a goal in mind of bird numbers or of particular species. But I think there's so many different ways that you can bird. You could have a big sit like birdability encourages, where you're more in one place, you're stationary, and you're passively observing the birds that are coming and passing by instead of actively kind of almost chasing them. I enjoy in the morning, just on my way to work, hearing the birds along my commute as I walk through a parking lot, for example. I'll hear a house finch singing and I try to look for it, but I don't have time. So even in those small little moments, I think we can incorporate birding in so many different ways, and there's no one right way to bird.
I know a lot of people started during the pandemic just with feeders. They would look at the birds because, they were cooped up in the house, but they put out a bird feeder and they got engrossed by what was coming to the bird feeders. And I know certainly the same thing as you just described, on your commute or whatever. I tend to go to the gym super early, and I'd be walking back from the gym in early March, and it's still cold, it's still winter, but you're hoping. And I'm walking home through the park, and I heard a fox sparrow, and I was like, fox sparrow! And it was so exciting. No binoculars needed, just sort of, what's out there. So, all right, well, since we're talking about bird experiences, I want to talk about how New York City occupies both a glorious position in birding history, in that we are the city. New York City is the city on the planet with the greatest number of breeding peregrine falcons in the world, in the whole world. And New York City occupies an ignominious place in birding history, because we're the place in North America where two devastating invasive species, the European starling that we've already discussed, and the house sparrow, European starling introduced in Central Park, house sparrow introduced in Greenwood Cemetery. And from those introductions, they just spread all over North America and wreaked havoc on our ecosystem. So New York City has this really interesting place in bird history. So that said, what's your favorite New York City bird story? And why don't we start with you, Akila?
So one of my most recent favorite bird stories, I do love birding in Queens, but I was actually at Prospect Park this past migration for spring migration. And I was with a friend from Ecuador. So he had really never seen most of the birds that were passing through. So almost every bird was a new bird, a life bird, and that was really exciting for him. And as we're walking, I noticed something on the ground and I started freaking out, because it was a bird that I didn't really know what it was, but I definitely knew it was in the nightjar family. And there are these very cryptic birds that camouflage super well with their surroundings. It was very dark brown on the ground sleeping. And I was just like, there's a bird there. We need to stop. And we put together our field guides, our knowledge. We asked some friends, and it was a Chuck Will's widow, which is pretty uncommon for New York City. And people were flocking to the area that we saw some people from the Brooklyn Bird Club. And it was really nice seeing the community very respectfully appreciating this bird. And it was behind a fence in part of Prospect Park, but also the number of people who were thanking me and saying that this was their also like their life bird. It was my first time seeing that bird, and it was so many other people's first times, and it was nice to share that moment with so many people who were strangers and friends.
Oh, that's fabulous. Kevin, your great New York City birding story.
So my great New York birding story was the first time I went birding in New York City, which was not that long ago. I happened to have the opportunity to go up to the Javits Center where New York City Audubon does research. And for those of you who don't know, there is a huge green roof on top of Javits Center. And I had the opportunity to go up there. And then I had the opportunity to also to get a personal guided trip of Governor's Island by Gabriel Willow, who's one of our guides at New York City Audubon. And I had already scheduled to have a friend of mine out of town come visit, and she was going to be there that day. So I said, well, just come with me. So she came with me, and it was magical being up on Javits, and it was kind of a foggy day. So you have little skyscrapers, and they had all the clouds, and you're looking at, and there was a bunch of gulls up there, which was really interesting. But it just, I had never really, even though I'm from Boston originally, and so I'm used to kind of an urban environment, but what really struck me was just all of these little pockets of areas where there's a lot of bird life and a lot of greenery that I never knew of. I had never heard of either Javits Center or Governor's Island before I went there. And so we spent the day, we went to Governor's Island, and again, it was magical. And then right when we were about to leave, the clouds kind of went away. And then I had this beautiful, sitting there waiting for the ferry to go back, this beautiful vista of Manhattan after seeing all these really amazing birds. And, as we're taking the train back, I was thinking in my head, like, wow, this would have been an amazing date to take somebody on. And fast forward a little bit longer, and now that person is my partner and just got a job and is moving out here now. So I'd like to believe that it was the birds of New York City that brought us together.
That is a great, perfect New York City birding story. Oh my God, I didn't know you were holding that in reserve. Excellent. But what I also love about that story is that it points out that when you're birding, it's not just the birds, it's the environments you find yourselves in, whether it's in New York City or outside of New York City, you're just in these places that are just spectacular, and you appreciate the places as much as you appreciate the birds, which I will throw it over to you, Jordan, because I know you don't have a New York City birding story because you haven't birded in New York City. But what would you like to see come to New York City and see?
Oh man, because I was gonna say that, well, first of all, I would love to have a New York birding extravaganza with all of you. And it's hard not to think about places like Central Park, to go birding. But so Mourning Warbler, which was earlier in Meredith's presentation, is a nemesis bird of mine. So that might be a good bird. I'm struggling to see it. I've tried a lot of times and would love to, but I also feel compelled to say even some of these famous breeding peregrine falcons would be amazing. Julie Hart, who is the coordinator of the New York Breeding Bird Atlas, is a friend of mine, so I'd love to do my little contribution to her project. And it's a great community science project that everyone can participate in if you're in New York.
The peregrines are absolutely, absolutely amazing. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention that I will just throw in now is that Kevin is the leading expert in the world on the Carolina parakeet, which just happens to be what Meredith opened her presentation with, was that Audubon plate of the Carolina parakeet. So even though it's extinct, Kevin is the expert on it. So go Kevin. I just had to throw that in because it's an interesting synergy there. So we're almost ready for some questions, I guess, from the audience, but I just want to end with one thing, which is for all of you. And we'll start with Jordan, then Kevin, then Akilah. What would you do, or what do you think would be best to make New York City and the world a better place both for birders and for birds?
More intentionality about listening, learning, growing, and moving forward together as a community. Now, I know that's a lot, but but let me quick break it down. We have to listen to all of our community members, include more different perspectives and voices, and then learn and grow and realize that the fact that you're asking that question means we have work to do. And it doesn't need to be overwhelming or scary if we can come together and move forward intentionally. And Bird Names for Birds is a great way to start doing that.
Excellent. Kevin.
So I'll go more of a practical route that's geared specific to New York City and perhaps other cities. As we've seen over the last month or so, that bird collisions with windows at buildings has been very dramatic. But this is something that happens every single migration, spring and fall, where we just see hundreds and hundreds of birds that die from flying into glass. And I would say that to make New York City a better place for birds, would be to support any kind of lights out legislation that would, because as we were saying before, the light pollution of New York City and other cities is what helps draw birds in. And so turning out the lights, especially during migration season, would be a way to not bring so many birds into the city where they end up flying into windows the next day where they see the reflection of a tree. And also, if you live in a building that has really reflective windows and you see dead birds on the sidewalk outside, have conversations with your building manager about retrofitting the glass by putting bird-friendly decals and stuff on the glass so the birds can see it and won't run into it. And for those of you who are out and about and find dead birds on the ground, if you could report that to dbird.org, which is a website that we use to track collisions, and so that we do scientific research in order to figure out the patterns of collisions so that we can better advocate and talk to the building managers and make recommendations to lessen the amount of birds that die in any of these given buildings. So that's something practical that people in New York and many others, and well, for dBird, you can put it anywhere, that can help birds in city environments.
Excellent. Akilah, you get the last word.
Yeah, so I think just going off of what Jordan said, listening to people who are typically excluded from the conversation, going to different communities and engaging with them earnestly and bringing birding, not necessarily to them, but uplifting them so that they can bring birding to themselves. I think lots of people are already birding, but maybe not necessarily in the same way that we are, and understanding why not and how we can better facilitate conversations and listening to the ornithologists who know the best about how to protect and save these birds.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We've got some questions now coming in, so let me throw a few of them at you. What can public land managers do to support and promote an inclusive and welcoming birding experience? Who wants to take that one first?
I can start a little bit with that. I think one thing that public land managers can do is seek out organizations that specialize in that, like Feminist Bird Club, like Queer Birders, New York City Queer Birders, and New York City Audubon, where we partner with organizations like Outdoor Afro. So I think that would be don't try to reinvent the wheel. There's already organizations that specialize in this. So just reach out to them and get their opinion and their advice, I think would be the best thing to do.
Excellent answer. Jordan, I'm going to lob this one at you. Are there any eponymous bird names named for a woman? Someone in the chat responded Anna's hummingbird, named after Anna Massena, or Massena, excuse me, Duchess of Rivoli. Also, Eleanor's falcon, I think. But are there any, or are those accurate examples?
There are a few eponymous bird names named after women. They are few and far between, which should not be surprising.
Blackburnian Warbler, named after Mrs.
Yes.
Blackburn.
And that was going to be the one that I contributed that wasn't listed. The other thing is that most eponymous bird names are very easy to identify in a field guide or the Merlin app because they have apostrophe S in that first word, right? So Audubon's Shearwater. And of course, there's always exception to the rule, and Blackburnian Warbler is the exception to the rule.
All right, let's see. How is climate change affecting NYC birds? And a related question, are new species present in NYC as a result of climate change? Akila, you want to take a stab at that?
So I'm not an ornithologist, so I'm not 100% sure, but I definitely know that we get different species of birds during eruption years. I know this year we had a finch eruption year, but that's typically standard every 10 years or so. I think Kevin might have better expertise on this.
Kevin?
Sure. So there's been a lot of research about this recently, as you can imagine. And as far as seeing new birds in New York City, I doubt that climate change has affected these birds to that extent to this point. However, we have seen shifts in what we call the phrenology of the birds, where they're moving at different times of the year and breeding at different times of the year to adjust to the new climate that they find themselves in. And we've actually scientists have documented that is already happening. And a research that just was published recently found that the morphology of birds is also shifting in concert with climate change. So there's a number of different adaptations that birds have.
By morphology, you mean?
Oh, the body, the different parts of the body. So like beak size, wing size, body mass, body size, all these different things that have these physiological benefits, being either in a cold area or in a hot area or an area with more rain or less rain. So we have started documenting these changes. And but as far as shifting the range of a species, to New York City that it wasn't otherwise, I don't think we've seen that yet. But certainly we probably will, maybe in my lifetime. Sorry, my cat's here.
Entering the discussion. I will jump in just with an apocryphal observation. Now, this is not science. This is just the observation of a birder who's old and therefore been doing it since he was about yay high, 10 years old. But when I was a kid, I did not see a red-bellied woodpecker until the family took a camping trip down to the Carolinas. Red-bellied woodpeckers now breed in Central Park up through the Hudson Valley. And as far as I know, they're in Massachusetts now and may even be breeding in Maine. So that is, the scientific name of the red-bellied woodpecker is Melanerpes carolinus, because they were a southern species that has pushed north. Now, can you attribute that to climate change? I do, but I haven't done the studies. I haven't done research, scientifically verifiable research. But it has changed in my lifetime that this bird that you would never see in New York is now a regular breeder in our area.
Yeah, northern cardinals are the same. There's been a number of species that have shipped, Carolina wrens as well. But it's probably, who knows?
All right, let's take a few more questions. How should new birders approach getting into the birding community in NYC? Oh, that's an interesting question. And how should we approach groups of established birders who seem kind of exclusive?
Yeah.
I
So
think we kind of touched on that, but Akira,
yeah.
run with this.
I definitely think attending an event, no matter what kind of group or club, New York City Audubon hosts lots of events. We have our Young Conservationist Council where we host events geared towards younger people and children. We had our Flappy Hour event where we met an owl. And so that was really fun. And that was a virtual event because of the pandemic, but just coming to any kind of event, Feminist Bird Club, Outdoor Afro, Latino Outdoors, New York City Queer Birders. There's so many different groups and resources online. I love going to the library to learn about birds. That's where I would get books and bird guides and read all day long if I could, and then take the books home with me and borrow them. So I think there's a lot of resources online for sure.
All right. And just to amplify that a little bit more, someone also asked, how can kids get involved in birding in New York? You kind of touched on that. You talked about your Flappy Hour. Are there any kids-specific things that you can further add that people can do?
So I believe,
sorry, go ahead.
I believe New York City Audubon has a kids member program. And even with the Feminist Bird Club, I remember Jen Kepler led an event that was like baby and me birding. So that was really fun. So I think there's not as many, but there definitely are some events that are geared towards younger people.
Yeah, and New York City Audubon's walks I know are open to all ages. So, and we provide, if we know in advance, we can provide binoculars on loan to people who don't have them. So,
Can I jump in quick?
Yes, absolutely. Please.
As I mentioned, Julie Hart's a good friend, so I just have to give a plug. The Breeding Bird Atlas, which is in New York and other states, is another really great option to consider because it focuses on the behavior of birds rather than the number of species that you see. So if you're just starting out and you really want to learn your ID, you don't need to know a lot of species to actually make really valuable contributions to community science projects like that.
Excellent. Someone asked, Christian, what is your best New York birding experience? I've been birding Central Park for like 35 years. So there's a lot of experiences. It's hard to put down any one, but the one that comes to mind immediately, because it's one of my favorite birds, the Blackburnian warbler, which is why I jumped in and stomped on your reveal, Jordan. I was birding along the southern edge of the reservoir in Central Park. And normally Blackburnian warblers stay very high in the tops of the trees. In migration, anything can happen though. And this particular Blackburnian warbler was low, in fact, at eye level, in fact, an arm's length away. And it did not care that I was there. Now, to understand the glory of a Blackburnian warbler, you have to understand this is a bird smaller than a sparrow, which is basically black and gray and white, except its entire face and throat is fiery day-glow orange. And this, when it's a male, and this male was arm's length, eye level, and he just sat there for 10 minutes, throwing his head back and belting out peals of his song. And I was paralyzed. I could not move. All I could do was sit there in the presence of this wonder and just watch him do his thing. And that was definitely one of my top New York birding experiences. But there's a lot of them. That's the great thing about birding in New York City. So many amazing experiences to be had in all parts of the city. It's great. And finally, last question, someone asked about the exhibition. So to bring it back to what spurred this whole conversation, the question is, are the Birds of America pages turned regularly in the exhibition? Do you go in order or do you get to choose what page to go to next? And the library responds, the library will be turning the pages periodically so that each opening isn't exposed to too much light. But the order hasn't been established just yet. It's opened to the bald eagle right now. And can I say to everybody who's watching this and listening, it is migration right now. It's funny how when you start birding, your whole concept of the world, of the city changes because you hear things, you notice things, you can't help it. you get attuned to new rhythms, like, oh, it's migration. And then it's like, oh, it's this part of migration where I might see this, this, and this. Oh, but in another week or two, I'll be seeing this, this, and this. And it just changes your whole perception. It is migration right now. Get out there and see what you can see. I was out at Riverside Park, not specifically to bird, but I did have my binoculars with me. This was a week ago. And I looked up, and speaking of, page open to bald eagle, right over Riverside Park in Manhattan, a bald eagle did a nice low turn and loop. And I'm like, bald eagle, bald eagle. I mean, because how many times do you see a bald eagle in the middle of Manhattan, you know? So get out there, enjoy it, get to the museum, the library, and enjoy it. I think exhibition museum. Go to the library and enjoy the exhibition, and please join the hordes of us who are out there enjoying the birds.